Japanese video game director Hifumi Kono loves horror movies. He discovered them during his years in college. Major classics like The Exorcist, The Omen, and Suspiria were amongst his favorites. In the early 90s, he got a job working for the video game company Human Entertainment. Human Entertainment was largely focused on one thing: developing sports games. Games like stadium events and Super Soccer. As such, the first game Kono directed was Human Grand Prix 2 for the Super Famicom. While the company did have an occasional non-sports title like Kamen Rider Black for the NES, the vast majority of their titles were sports-related. Kono felt stifled by the insistence to make sports games and wanted to branch out to make something different. He wanted to bring his love of horror to video games. At the time, horror games were few and far between, especially in Japan. The two standouts were Sweet Home and Splatterhouse. After a lot of convincing, he worked with members of the planning division at Human, who negotiated with upper management to let them work on an original, non-sports title. This was a little easier now, since Human had a few successful ones. In 1993, they released Septentrion, and in 1994, they released The Fireman. The executives decided to hold a competition where anyone in the company could participate. They had to present a game design, and the one that they liked the most would go into production. Kono presented his ideas for a horror game unlike any other, Clock Tower, which obviously was the game the studio chose to put into production. The game takes massive inspiration from the 1985 Dario Argento film Phenomena. The game's story focuses on a group of orphans who are adopted by a rich eccentric family, the Barrows. They all live in this giant mansion in the middle of nowhere. The protagonist is Jennifer, one of the orphans who moves into the house. As Jennifer explores the property, strange things begin to happen, all of which culminates in the arrival of the Scissor Man, a demon-like figure wielding a gigantic pair of scissors as his murder weapon. His in-game name was Bobby. While the character of Bobby was largely influenced by Phenomena, the giant scissors were inspired by Cropsy from the 1981 film The Burning. Playing as Jennifer, you need to solve the mystery of the house and survive the night. There are 9 endings, but only one true ending. The lead character in Clock Tower, Jennifer, is based on Jennifer Connelly's character in Phenomena, Jennifer Corvino. The game shared many ideas from Argento's films beyond Phenomena, things like bizarre ties to the occult and young women in peril. The director wanted the game to feel like you were playing a horror movie. The motion capture model for Jennifer was Yasuko Terada, who was a game director on other titles from Human Entertainment. They photographed her movements, imported it into the computer, and digitized it into pixel art, a technique that was in vogue at the time. This gave Jennifer's movements a fluidity of motion. Kono said Terada did a wonderful job of doing movements like hanging from a projection above the entrance to the roof terrace and stumbling in the hallway. As far as the game mechanics, they made Clock Tower as a point-and-click adventure. Since this was going to be released on the Super Famicom, they needed to find a way to make it work well with the joypad. To simplify this, they made it so that when you moved the D-pad, there were hotspots to click on. For normal movements, you'd click on an area you wanted Jennifer to go to. However, when Jennifer was in danger, you could use the L and R buttons as a panic mode to get her to run in that direction. Although in keeping with the horror theme, you have limited stamina, and running will deplete it, so you have to be careful. Kono looked further into what fascinated him about films like Suspiria and Phenomena. What he came up with was the suspense of being chased and the thrill of hiding from the killer while holding your breath. Neither of these aspects existed in video games at the time. The director said, "One of the fundamental concepts of the project was not simply to add a horror theme to the game design, but rather to apply horror films to the game system itself. In horror films, it would be strange to see the heroine running indefinitely. At some point, she'll run out of breath and be unable to run, and you feel a sense of crisis as she risks being trapped. So the game mechanics came about by trying to make the game seem real. Jennifer wasn't a superhero. She was a scared 14-year-old girl. So she moves slowly, gets scared easily, and it takes her what feels like ages to get to safety. Running and hiding is your only option." Kono said this was the biggest element that would make the game scary. At the time, there was a mouse add-on for the Super Famicom. However, the install base for the console mouse was very low, and so they would have had to make two separate control systems, one for the standard controller and one for the mouse. From a business perspective, it wasn't economically feasible to do this. They would have needed a larger team and more money, two things they weren't going to get. Clock Tower was an experimental game with a very small dev team, and as such, the budget and support for the game was minimal. The initial concept was too large for their budget, so they had to cut down the size of the map because they didn't have the resources to make it. The bosses at Human had their doubts about the game's concept. Jennifer couldn't fight back against the Scissor Man. Her only defense was to run and hide. The director stated, "People around me said that a game where the protagonist runs away from the enemy would not work. Under normal circumstances, the executives may have tried to implement some changes into the game. However, something was going on at Human that ended up being beneficial to Clock Tower being made with little outside tampering. At the time, most of the company was focused on its flagship wrestling series, Fire Pro Wrestling. While most titles at Human had a small dev team of less than 10 people, Fire Pro had somewhere between 20 to 30 people working on it. As such, Kono and his team were able to stay focused on the game they wanted to make since the bosses were preoccupied with the larger game. The team working on Clock Tower was about 7 people. Although there was one team member who was constantly complaining about how the game was boring. Clock Tower was released on September 14th, 1995, exclusively in Japan. It was a surprise hit for Human Entertainment. The employee who claimed the game was boring changed his tune when the game was a hit. He now proudly proclaimed, "I worked on this!" The Japanese video game magazine Famitsu gave Clock Tower a 31 out of 40. The game sold very well, which surprised the publisher and led to them greenlighting another horror title, Twilight Syndrome, which was released in 1996. They also made another horror game, Mizurna Falls, which was released exclusively in Japan in 1998. With the success of Clock Tower, Human Entertainment wanted a sequel. Initially, Kono wasn't interested. However, he changed his mind once he saw the technical possibilities of the next-generation consoles. There were limitations within the Super Famicom, but the hardware in the Sony PlayStation opened up a new world of possibilities. This sequel to Clock Tower was one of the first games developed by Human Entertainment to utilize a 3D graphics engine, something that was still very new at the time. The original Resident Evil was announced while they were working on the game, and the team challenged themselves to create high-quality graphics to compete with that title. On December 13, 1996, they released Clock Tower 2 for the PS1 exclusively in Japan, which was a sequel to Clock Tower on the Super Famicom. This was an entirely new game with a new story and polygon graphics instead of pixels. Although they did keep the point-and-click style of gameplay, which was seen as integral to the game's design, kind of like how the original Resident Evil is tied to tank controls. Seeing the demand for horror games, Human decided to take the series beyond Japan. The PS1 version of Clock Tower 2 was released in North America roughly 10 months later on October 10, 1997. But since it was the first game in the series to be made available outside of Japan, it was simply called Clock Tower for Western audiences. The point-and-click controls baffled some American console gamers who weren't used to this outside of PC adventure games. To make things slightly more confusing, Clock Tower: The First Fear, an enhanced port of the Super Famicom game, was released for the PlayStation on July 17, 1997 in Japan. Both the original Clock Tower and The First Fear never had an official release outside of Japan, so audiences elsewhere thought Clock Tower for the PS1 was the first entry in the series. The game sold well enough that Human wanted another sequel. Although Kono wasn't involved in this one, Yutaka Harada took over as the game director. March 12, 1988, Clock Tower Ghost Head was released in Japan, and then November 3, 1999, it was released in the US under the name Clock Tower 2: The Struggle Within. After Clock Tower 2 was released, Kono was in the process of returning to the franchise. He had concepts for the next game in the franchise. His vision would be for the game to sidestep Ghost Head and go back to the original 2. The game would revolve around doors found in urban areas with multiple cities that would lead into a world of Scissor Man. Jennifer and her daughter would be the protagonists. However, that didn't happen. Human Entertainment was having some financial problems, and the game was canceled. Then Human Entertainment went bankrupt, and they officially went out of business in 2000. Sunsoft, the video game division of the electronics manufacturer Sun Corporation, acquired the Clock Tower license in 2001. Sunsoft partnered with Capcom to make Clock Tower 3, although it was technically the fourth Clock Tower game. This was a standalone title with a new cast that was intended to be a series reboot. The game was much different from the previous entries, although it did seem to be borrowing a little bit from Kono's game design. They got rid of the point-and-click gameplay, and it was much more focused on action than previous titles. Scissor Man was present, but also Scissor Woman, and a variety of other killers. Kinji Fukasaku, the director of the now classic movie Battle Royale, directed the cutscenes for the game. Clock Tower 3 for the PS2 was released on December 12, 2002 in Japan, and March 18, 2003 in the US. It did not sell well. Fans of the previous Clock Tower games didn't like the shift towards action and the complete change in the gameplay. Although, ironically, the game scored a 33 out of 40 on Famitsu, which was 2 points higher than the original Clock Tower in 1995. After Human Entertainment's bankruptcy, Hifumi Kono went on to start his own company, Nude Maker. Nude Maker created some unique games, from Steel Battalion in 2002 to Infinite Space in 2009. Kono was asked how to make games that appeal to a worldwide audience. He said, "How much should you adapt your work to the market, whether it's the domestic market or the overseas market? If you ignore that question altogether and just create what you think is fun, you will find at least some measure of success." This was the case for me with Clock Tower and Steel Battalion. So sticking to your own ideas in the face of market expectations can result in good games. Thanks to some dedicated fans of the original Clock Tower, they were able to do a full translation of the game and made it available as a downloadable ROM so that English-speaking audiences could finally enjoy this groundbreaking title. However, again, it was never officially translated from Japanese into English or any other language. In 2005, there was the Clock Tower spiritual sequel called Haunting Ground, which was also released by Capcom. Haunting Ground was called Demento in Japan. Most of the dev team from Clock Tower 3 worked on Haunting Ground. The original script for Haunting Ground was written by Clock Tower 3's Noboru Sugimura. It was an edited version of a rejected Resident Evil 4 script. The script, when it was still Resident Evil 4, was about Leon Kennedy investigating Umbrella's headquarters. There was a subplot about a girl waking up in a mansion and befriending a dog. They removed this subplot and evolved it into what would become Haunting Ground. The game was a modest success, but underperformed, possibly due to it being released so soon after the blockbuster Resident Evil 4. Even though the game wasn't a hit, there was a lot of love put into it by the developers, and the game has a dedicated fan base. Seeing as how there was still a demand for Clock Tower-style games, Hifumi Kono spoke to an unnamed publisher about doing a reboot or a re-release of Clock Tower, but they didn't agree to it because they said horror games are difficult to market. Frustrated with this news and the direction of the Clock Tower series, Kono took to Kickstarter to crowdfund a proper sequel. Since he didn't own the Clock Tower name, he would have to call it something else and make it similar but different. Wanting to do a redesign of the Scissor Man, he hired Masahiro Ito, the creature designer for Silent Hill 1, 2, and 3. Ito came up with a new villain, this Scissor Walker. Kono said, "This game is not the type where you encounter a myriad of monsters, but a story centered around the Scissor Walker. As such, it was important for us to come up with a design for the Scissor Walker that would be compelling to our fans. The first person that came to mind that had the capability to respond to such a request was Mr. Ito. The only thing I asked of him before he began designing was to forget about Clock Tower and do whatever he likes. But Mr. Ito designed the Scissor Walker in such a way that Clock Tower fans would enjoy it as well." Wanting to bring in even more horror cred, Kono collaborated with Takashi Shimizu, the director of Ju-On the Curse 1 and 2, Ju-On the Grudge 1 and 2, and other disturbing J-horror films. The end result was Night Cry, which was released in March of 2016. Shimizu made a short film that was a companion to the game. While Nightcry was channeling much of Clock Tower, the game it was based on, some considered it a flawed experience. Although the game does have its fans, negative reviews lamented how antiquated it felt compared to modern titles. Meanwhile, fans of the game rejoiced at how unapologetically old school it was, feeling very much like a new Clock Tower installment. Being that it was so divisive, it was seen as a niche title, and it was not the hit the director was hoping for. That seemed like it might be the last Clock Tower game, even as a spin-off. Although, much like the Scissor Man, you can never count this series as dead. 6 years later, in 2022, independent game studio WayForward had just released River City Girls Zero, an enhanced port of Shin Niketsu Koha, Kanaitachi no Banka, which never made it to the US. The game was only ever officially released on the Super Famicom in Japan. The game was a huge success, and they realized there was an appetite for this style of remake. Unofficially, WayForward called this type of release a Port Plus, since it wasn't a remake or a remaster, but a classic game enhanced with extra content. They put together a list of games they wanted to enhance next, and landed on Clock Tower. The goal with Port Plus was to take a game that had not officially been released in the US and Europe, but has fans in those regions that are aware of it and want to play the game. That's the magic formula and the reason why they chose to do Clock Tower as their second Port Plus project. Although the original Clock Tower was never released in the US, thanks to the internet, many fans over here already knew about it. Before WayForward was able to do anything, they had to make sure they could acquire the rights to the game. They contacted the current co-owners of the franchise, Sunsoft, to try to get collaboration approval. Sunsoft was very interested in the idea, possibly because in 2021 they put out a tweet mentioning how they'd like to remake some of their retro titles in the near future and were asking for suggestions. One of the biggest responses was for the original Clock Tower. Sunsoft was interested right out of the gate. The hardest part of the whole ordeal was all the legal stuff and hammering out a deal, which took several months. Once they got the official approval, production began around mid-2023. They wanted to make sure and have the original creator on hand to help with the project, and were lucky to collaborate with Hifumi Kono. They brainstormed names for the game, but decided the best was Clock Tower Rewind. That was the one that stuck with the team the most. The game was announced in July of 2023. Shortly after that, once they went into production, they contacted Kono. He was unaware of the port at the time, but was more than happy to come on board to assist. Kono-san gave them his feedback and guidance, in addition to his blessing to work on the port. Beyond that, he sat down for an interview, which they recorded as a bonus feature for the game. The creative lead for the Port Plus of the game, Mariel Cartwright, was a big Giallo fan. She was most excited about working on Clock Tower since it took direct inspiration from Dario Argento's films. Beyond that, the whole team at WayForward loved horror games, as you can see by their track record. Games like Blood Rain Betrayal and Aliens Infestation. Clock Tower fits perfectly into the games they enjoy working on. The team for the port's relatively small. They have roughly 7 dedicated team members who worked with a variety of freelancers, artists, musicians, and voice actors. They stress that this will be sticking as close to the game's roots as possible. It's the original 16-bit game, with all the original graphics, sound, and gameplay, plus a bunch of bonus additions. They're releasing it with 2 modes. First, the original mode, which is a direct port of the original Super Famicom game, plus the second mode called Rewind, which has various gameplay adjustments and features backported from Clock Tower The First Fear, the PS1 port of the original. The main improvements in the Rewind mode are that the game is a bit easier to play. However, if you're a purist that wants to play the game it was originally conceived, there's that too. While Clock Tower did get a few unofficial fan translations over the years, the team went back to the original Japanese text and did a brand new translation, which stayed as close as possible to the original text. They did refer to the unofficial ones a few times to cross-check how fans commonly understood certain items or phrasings, for consistency's sake. However, when it came to the full translation, they started from scratch. For the game's engine, Carbon Team used their proprietary engine and tools to get classic games like Clock Tower ported to modern systems as well as all the extra features and functionality. Things like saving anywhere and rewind to fix small mistakes that could lead to a game over. As a way to make the game a little more special, they wanted to create a new animated intro. The color design was by J.N. Weedle. The Studio Future Club assisted with the animation, backgrounds, and compositing, and Manuel Malahua assisted with the backgrounds. The animated sequences were directed by Mariel Cartwright. As another way to appeal to the horror game audience, they reached out to Mary Elizabeth McGlynn. The team were all huge Silent Hill fans, as well as her work on the series. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to hear her in another horror game. She agreed and did a new song for the intro. Later in the production, they decided to make an outro song too, so they contacted Emmy Evans. Her name came up from them loving her work on Nier, and as luck would have it, they had a connection from the team and had a fairly easy time getting her on board. Visually, the game is identical to the original Super Famicom version. The additional new extras for the game come in the form of things like the new intro, or them animating the original manga scans, only now with voiceovers, special effects, and music. While working on the project, they were able to get everything they set out to put into it. Since the rights discussion wasn't as difficult as they first imagined, they had additional time to include more extras than they originally planned. While making games is often filled with all sorts of unusual circumstances, the unusual thing here was how normal everything was. The team said it was an easy production. Everyone they reached out to was more than happy to be involved, which was great and almost unheard of. When they officially announced the port, they were overwhelmed by the reaction. They said it was incredibly positive, and that made the team very happy. They knew they made the right decision and wanted to make sure the game would not disappoint. The game is now finished and ready to be released to Western audiences. The digital release for the Americas and Europe is Tuesday, October 29th, just in time for Halloween. It's also getting a physical release from Limited Run Games, including a collector's edition. WayForward have other Port Plus titles in mind, but nothing that they can officially announce yet. They're in talks with several IP rights holders, so it looks like there will be more enhanced ports making their way here in the future. Might I suggest Deep Fear, Police Knots, and Sweet Home? Maybe another human title, Mizurna Falls? Clock Tower is seen as one of the most influential titles in Japanese horror games. Beyond that, it's considered one of the founding survival horror titles, along with Project Firestart in 1989 and Alone in the Dark in 1992. Here we are almost 30 years later, and its influence can still be felt. For example, there's an indie game coming soon called Midnight Special, which really looks like a glorious homage to Clock Tower. Beyond that, look at games like Amnesia, Alien Isolation, and Outlast, games that use the hide-and-seek gameplay that started all the way back with Clock Tower. Hifumi Kono took his love of horror movies, combined it with his love of video games, and created a groundbreaking title that, as of currently, has 2 remasters, 3 sequels, and 2 spiritual sequels. There was almost a Clock Tower movie too, but that never happened for a variety of reasons. Clock Tower is an amazing, enduring horror franchise. It may not be as well known as Resident Evil or Silent Hill, but it has a rabid fanbase all the same. Seeing all the passion put into the port of Clock Tower makes this all the more special. I love that this isn't just a port, but a complete overhaul that adds in new material for those who want it, but still has the original, untampered version for people who want that old school experience. This is the first time the game will officially be available outside of Japan. It's amazing that all these years later, we're getting a definitive re-release of the game that'll make it accessible to everyone, from fans of the series who weren't able to play it in the past, to the next generation of fans who will be playing it in the future.
I love you. I love you all.